Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Star Wars News and Memes, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think that even if the sequels and other Disney content were the exact same but Disney had a more professional PR campaign, things would be different? I mean, Kathleen Kennedy not being so vocal about how women have apparently never been into Star Wars, no Rian Johnson saying our Snoke theories suck, no calling fans racist, sexist, no falling out with John Boyega, etc. Just Disney making the exact same content, but with them saying things like Rey is a different take on the hero's journey, with no reference to gender. Disney responds to fan criticism with things like, taste is subjective, not everyone is going to like it. Boyega not getting shafted in the marketing and stuff like that. In this type of world, do you feel like the state of the fan base is better?" And that is a very interesting question, and kind of reminds me of something my wife brings up about the Captain Marvel movie, and soon enough you'll understand the connection between that and the question. But she doesn't think that film itself is as, whatever you want to call it, as man-hating or feminist or as girl power as some claim it to be. That it was mainly everything around the movie that Brie Larson had said and said before it ever came out that in a sense kind of tainted it or made some go into it looking for all that or to view it through a different lens. And then of course they found what they were looking for. But funny enough, many of the things Brie Larson said would have, not all too long ago, before the day and age of social media and especially before the internet, it would have only been seen and heard by very, very few people and would have had virtually no way to spread or go viral. I mean, the rather infamous comment she made about not caring about what 40-year-old white dudes had to say about A Wrinkle in Time was made at the Crystal plus Lucy Awards, which is something that, no offense to the very prestigious event, I'm sure, but that's something very few people know of or would have ever heard of or cared about not all that long ago. And again, what she said there and some of the other things she said would have never gone viral or influenced opinions of people before watching Captain Marvel. Many would have, the vast, vast majority, would have just viewed it as the next Marvel movie and would have loved or hated it based only on that. And the thing is, as far as I remember, I've only seen the movie once and don't recall it flawlessly. But if memory serves, there's really only one moment or scene that's really sort of overt or in-your-face girl power, for lack of a better way of putting it. And that's when she steals the guy's motorcycle after he tells her to smile or whatever.
You're lighting up, honey, huh? Got a smile for me?
That could certainly feel very on the nose, especially if you, again, went into the film looking for that sort of thing. But if you weren't looking for it, you might not think twice about that scene or notice it or care about it at all. And what I think would be really interesting is if you could take that movie, take Captain Marvel with no changes made to it whatsoever, and have it come out in the 90s, which is the time period the film is set in, and see what the reaction to it would be back then, minus, of course, any and all the comments made by Brie Larson. We'll just assume she would have never made them had it come out back then, and that this was just your standard 1990s release. Now sure, it's got some pretty good special effects for the time, but assuming those were watered down a bit for the era, how many people do you think would watch it and find any sort of issue with it whatsoever back then? Which isn't to say they'd think it was a good movie, but would they have some sort of genuine issue with it or any of the messaging in it? And so honestly now, setting aside whatever dislike you may or may not have for Brie Larson or that film, ask yourself, do you think the motorcycle guy scene in the movie on the whole, does it cause a stir 25 years ago? Or, since we again don't have social media yet to cause a stir, do you think people take issue with it the same way they did nowadays? Or does all of that just largely get laughed off or ignored by audiences in the 90s? And if the answer to that is yes, which I think it is, I don't think 25 years ago most people think twice or care about that scene or the general message of girl power in the movie. I don't know that they really notice it. Sure, some might roll their eyes and grumble about some of it, but no one's getting that upset or having it stick with them even a day later. Anyway, if the answer is yes, why is that? What has changed over that time? And though I could go down a whole other rabbit hole with this video, if I'm not already, I think what's changed is how much we hear from celebrities these days. It wasn't all that long ago that if you weren't watching something like, say, Entertainment Tonight or reading entertainment or movie magazines, you really weren't hearing the thoughts and views of celebrities all that often. And even then, if you were reading or watching that stuff, it was mainly either just gossip type stuff or them talking about, the actual films or shows they were going to be in, not their beliefs on everything. Which then finally brings us back to the original question. What if Disney and Lucasfilm had approached or sort of marketed the sequel trilogy differently, but everything else about the movies themselves was the same? And I think to a degree, maybe things could have been a little different. The fan base might not be quite as bad as it is right now. Because, I mean, before the film ever came out, we were not entirely unlike the Brie Larson situation, but we were hearing from Kathleen Kennedy about how important Rey was going to be, not just to the story of Star Wars or these movies, but kind of to our society on the whole. There were several interviews and articles from before the release of The Force Awakens where she talked about all this. However, unlike with Brie Larson, where that became this huge thing before the film ever came out, with Rey in The Force Awakens, virtually no one had much of an issue or took notice of what Kennedy was saying about it because, well, we were still living in a pre-Rey world. As I argued in a video the other day, Rey was kind of the harbinger of this change. She was arguably the first time such a big deal was made about the importance of a character to the real world. And with her being the first, again, no one really took notice or issue or knew what that was going to mean for the films or for the story in them. Most fans just thought, Rey's going to be a great character and women will love her, like Kennedy says, but men will love her too because Star Wars is for everyone, and of course you're gonna make a character that appeals to everyone but this film. And so you're not going to find much hate for Rey from before the film started coming out, or for Kathleen Kennedy. I'd even go so far as to say that your average fan probably didn't even know who Kathleen Kennedy was at that point in time. What then went wrong is after the first film came out, after The Force Awakens was released, and even more articles were being published about Rey, and some were literally hailing her a feminist icon, and at the same time that many in the media were placing her upon this pedestal and hailing her the greatest thing to ever happen to films for women, there were those in the fan base, rather independent of these articles, who started saying or grumbling, Rey's a little Mary Sue, isn't she? Which is, of course, when and how the war waged by the media on the fanbase kicked off. And long story short, how we got to where we are today. Though what's interesting about that being what truly ignited it is even going back to a year before The Force Awakens came out, when the first trailer came out and there was this big deal about Finn being a black stormtrooper and some were hating on him. The media, for the most part, just labeled the people doing it as trolls. They weren't blaming the fan base just yet or labeling a large portion of them toxic and hateful. They were actually pointing to the individuals doing it and saying they were the problem, not that there was a problem within the fan base itself. That kind of talk more or less started with Rey after The Force Awakens and went full on DEFCON 1 after The Last Jedi. That's when, after even more fans rejected Rey and that film in general, the media really kicked it up a notch and the name calling started. And none of this was helped by Rian Johnson's reaction to the film. But honestly, it was too late at that point. I think Johnson and some of the things he said only hastened how bad things got or would get. Though on the flip side, had he just been like, you know what, it's fine if some people hate my movie and I get why some were disappointed with the way Luke was, but it's all good. Maybe if he says or does something like that, to some degree again, it alters the course of history and things aren't quite as bad. Problem is, I still think the media is relentless in their attacks over or defending Rey. That's what really set them off, not so much the attacks on Rian Johnson. And mind you, yes, there were those in the fan base making videos who were equally, shall we say, aggressive in their attacks on the media or on the films or on Rey or whatever it might be. I've said before that you had this sort of feedback loop where the media would say something ridiculous about the fans, the fan base would respond with videos, and then the media, could respond back, and then the fans could respond back again. And both sides got a whole lot of clicks and made a whole lot of money on this little war. Anyway, it was at this point when Disney and Lucasfilm sat back and did absolutely nothing to diffuse the situation. They did nothing when hate pieces against their fan base became rather commonplace. And though I'm by no means trying to defend Disney and Lucasfilm, but they were, at this point, in a no-win situation here. If they came out and in any way defended the fans that were being attacked, even said something as simple as, it is okay to not like Rey or the films, the media would have been all over them because they would have been seen as siding with the hateful part of the fan base. Though you could certainly argue this was all a storm of Kathleen Kennedy's creation, one that ultimately came about by her sort of priming the media with all her talk about how important Rey was going to be to the real world, making it sound like she was the first woman in Star Wars ever, instead of her just talking about how there'd always been great female characters in Star Wars and that Rey was simply going to be the next one. In other words here, it is possible Kennedy not saying anything initially about Rey changes things in the long run, but I do still think the media jumps to the defense of Rey regardless because, again, it wasn't so much a response to what Kennedy said initially, it was just a response to Rey in the films that got the fan base going. So I do think things are relatively the same in the long run because if the movies, again, are the same, you're still going to have the fans who didn't like them and didn't like Rey and said as much. Again, they were not responding to the articles, they were just responding to those films. Though without Kennedy saying what she did beforehand, maybe, just maybe, it doesn't get quite as bad or as heated, but who knows. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to weigh in on this one. Would things be different if the sequel films were the same, but things around them were handled differently? Or does history repeat itself regardless? Or you can always leave a comment for a future lightning response video. Just ask your question by starting your comment off with "Hey Thor." Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.